Tonight, we're going to spend some time talking about Good Friday. We're going to talk a little bit about what it is and why we celebrate it. And then we're going to take a few minutes just around a table, maybe like the table you're around tonight. And we're going to talk about what Good Friday has meant or looked like to us individually. I think oftentimes Good Friday becomes one of those celebrations that feels very different than the rest of what it means to be a Christian or to celebrate Easter. And for some of us, if you're like me, you didn't really grow up with this. And so in a year where we're able to do something a little different and offer this to more people online, I hope that God uses this in your life to open up maybe different parts of your understanding of celebrating this weekend.
Man of sorrows, Lamb of God, by his own betrayed, the sin of man and wrath of God has been on Jesus laid. Silent as he stood accused, beaten, mocked, and scorned, bowing to the Father's will, he took a crown of thorns. And oh, the rugged cross, my salvation, where your love poured out over me. Now my soul cries out, hallelujah, praise and honor unto thee. Sent of heaven, God's own Son, to purchase and redeem and reconcile the very ones who nailed him to that tree. And oh, the rugged cross, my salvation, where your love poured out over me. Now my soul cries out, hallelujah, praise and honor unto thee. And oh, that rugged cross, my salvation, where your love poured out over me. Now my soul cries out, hallelujah, praise and honor unto thee. Praise and honor unto thee.
Good Friday is called good because of what it accomplishes, but it actually, when you look at it, isn't very good. It's the night that Jesus would be betrayed. It's the beginning of ultimately what would happen for you and me to be able to have a relationship with God because of his crucifixion and resurrection. As a matter of fact, Good Friday really gets started on what's called Maundy Thursday, in a meal just like this one, where Jesus and his closest friends would have celebrated Passover, a Jewish meal of celebration that they had celebrated every year of their lives to remember God's faithfulness for his people in Egypt. And if you maybe have been a part of church before, or you've heard it, you've probably heard some of these ideas before, right? When you think about this in Matthew's account, in Matthew 26, he says, "Now as they were eating, Jesus took bread, and after blessing it, he broke it and gave it to the disciples. He said, 'Take, eat, this is my body.' And he took the cup, and when he'd given thanks, he gave it to them. And he said, 'Drink of it, all of you, for this is my blood of the new covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will not drink again of this fruit of the vine until the day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom.'" See, Jesus knew where he was headed. Jesus knew what was coming, even though those around him very clearly didn't, as they continue this conversation moving forward. And as Jesus waits for his betrayer, Judas, to give him up, he finds himself in a season where he's actually asking God if there's another option. It's called the Garden of Gethsemane. And in this garden, he essentially asks God for another option. And as he asks God, he says, "God, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done." Jesus says, if there's no other option, if this is the only plan in which people can come to know you, I'm still willing to do it. And ultimately, that's what starts off this pattern in which Jesus would go from a meal with his friends, sharing the most important ideas that he knew they would need to carry with them, into this revelation of a new kingdom being introduced to everyone, everywhere. He knew that his sacrifice would be necessary for that to take place. And then eventually he gets condemned by the religious leaders, and then he's brought, because they're a part of Roman rule, to Pilate, and then he gets scourged. And the scourging of Jesus is one of those things that I think sometimes we gloss over. We think about how Jesus died on a cross for us. We think about the things that would have been incredibly painful, incredibly humiliating about that. But before Jesus had to carry his own cross, before Jesus would be hung up on that cross, before Jesus would be nailed to the cross, he was beaten with weapons designed for torture. And the entire time, he was doing it for you. He was doing it for me. And the reason that we can call it Good Friday, the reason that we can take a step back and realize this, is because of that continued realization. That your sin and my sin, God took so seriously that the work he was willing to do was this kind of sacrifice for you and for me. And so now, with his back absolutely devastated from torture, exhausted, dehydrated, malnourished, he finds himself, with the aid of a stranger, carrying his cross to the site of the crucifixion, where he would be hung, and really he would have these unbelievable moments and conversations. One moment where Jesus actually says, "Forgive them, Father. They don't know what they are doing." He's saying that to the guards around him that are mocking him, but at the same time, he's saying that to you and me. He's saying that to us before we would realize how great an offense our life going our own direction truly is. The judgment that we deserve, God poured out on him. That's what Good Friday represents. And it doesn't mean it wasn't without pain. Jesus experienced physical pain that had been reserved for the most heinous of criminals. And while he's experiencing that, he offers forgiveness to thieves at his side. While he's experiencing that, he offers forgiveness to guards, betting and fulfilling prophecy over his own clothing. While he's experiencing that, a crown of thorns that they put on his head to mock him is piercing his forehead, causing blood to run down his face and his body. Maybe you don't know this, but the way people typically died of crucifixions was not because of blood loss. It was because of asphyxiation. They would find themselves suffocating to death as they hung on the cross. And you would lift yourself up to catch your breath. And then hang back down. And every time you did that, the pain and the damage and the splinters and the nails through his hands and his feet for you and me did greater and greater damage, while at the same time taking greater and greater strength away from him to get the next breath. And as Jesus hung on the cross and waited for what he knew would be inevitable, for what he knew would happen, in Matthew 27 it says, "And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit." See, Jesus was not just experiencing the physical pain of scourging, of crucifixion. He was not just experiencing the relational betrayal of everyone that had been close to him, people that had seen him commit unbelievable acts of kindness, people that had seen him deliver incredible miracles, walk away from him universally. But he was also experiencing something he had never felt before. He said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" See, in that moment, God had to look at Jesus and see you and me, so that today, thousands of years later, he could look at you and me and see Jesus. It's this idea called imputed righteousness. And the idea of Good Friday is so good because this righteousness from God is made available to you and to me. And look, if Good Friday comes and goes and Easter never arrives, none of this matters. But because we know what's coming on the third day, we can look with incredible hope at the weight and the pain Jesus went through. And over the next few minutes, as you hear and listen to people share a little bit about their story and their experience of Good Friday, I hope what you will remember and maybe remind yourself of for the first time in a long time is that God cares about your pain, that what you're going through, he is sympathetic to. In a world that pushes pain aside, in a world that ignores people who have lots of needs or challenges, Jesus took the ultimate step to meet your needs, to address your challenges, and to offer relationship with you that's still available today. Does it hurt? Of course. Is the pain you feel real? Absolutely. But we have a high priest. We have a Savior that understands our pain, that paid the ultimate cost so that your pain, so that my pain doesn't have to be permanent, so that your failures don't have to be fatal, because they were fatal to him.
My favorite service growing up was the Good Friday service. And I don't really entirely know why I loved it so much, except for on the way out from Good Friday service, I always found my mom. I just would hold her hand and I'd look up at her and she'd just have tears in her eyes, and I didn't fully understand why. Wasn't this exciting? Wasn't Easter a good season? And we'd get into the car after just a walk of silence, and my mom would just whisper, "I can't believe he did this for us so that we don't have to taste death." And that phrase just stuck with me for a long time, and I didn't fully understand it until probably a couple years ago. In 2019, on Good Friday, I woke up to a text from my mom, and the text said, "Grandpa is no longer with us." My mom's dad had passed away, and we knew it was coming. It wasn't a surprise. I had visited him a month before, and yet, as I was sitting there on Good Friday, there was something so final about it, so different about that day. And while I didn't process it right away, it kind of sat with me throughout, and the world just felt different because I knew he wasn't in it. And that night I went to the Good Friday service here at Eastern Hills, and I sat in the back row, and it finally hit. As I sat in that back row, it finally hit that my grandpa's not here. This day that we celebrate Jesus' death is the same day that the person closest to my family no longer is with us. And as I sat in that back row and I just began to weep, it became so clear what Jesus came to do. You see, my grandpa's passing was new to me. I had not seen or experienced death up until this point. I hadn't fully understood it, and yet in this moment, my family was hurt, and I'm sitting alone. And as I sat alone and listened to the message of Jesus willingly tasting death, Jesus willingly walking through suffering, Jesus willingly taking on something that I can never fully understand, I had a taste for it in a new way. And what blows my mind and leaves me absolutely speechless is Jesus did it 2,000 years ago so that when we experience it now, it isn't final. It isn't the end. He took on something then so that moments like this, as I sit by myself in tears, overwhelmed with an earthly death, I know that there is more to the story. I know that it isn't final. And I could never earn that or deserve that or understand that. And I don't think even while I'm here and while I sat in that back row, I will fully understand what Jesus gave to me, but my mom's words live on. Jesus took on something, took on death, so that we would never have to fully taste and experience it on this side of earth.
A couple of years ago, I had a really bad week. I was supposed to speak here at Eastern Hills, and I got up in front of my coworkers and friends on Thursday to do a practice message and get some feedback, and I couldn't get through it. Stopped about halfway through and just got overwhelmed by my anxiety. And in that same week, I had a really bad breakup. And it felt like everything that mattered to me in my life at the time was falling apart, that I'd lost all of it. And I got home late one night that week, and I remember trying to get out of my car and go into my house, and I just couldn't. And I sat in my car late at night, and I just got angry. I yelled at God, and I remember slamming my fists on the steering wheel and asking him why he would create such strong desires in me for things that he knew I couldn't have. Why was I feeling so much pain and so much hurt this week? And in that moment, I felt like Jesus was sitting in the passenger seat next to me. And I remembered a Good Friday story that Phil talked about just a minute ago, where Jesus is in the garden and he's praying to God, and he's hurting. He knows what he's about to lose: his friends, his family, his connection to himself, to God. And it says that he was so anxious that he was sweating, and his sweat was like drops of blood. And in that moment, I realized that Jesus knew how I was feeling. And I felt like God said, Dustin, I know what you're going through. And it wasn't condescending, and it wasn't belittling to the pain I was feeling, but I knew that Jesus had felt what I was feeling and more. And not only that, he felt it so that I could trust that he was with me when I was feeling it. Jesus died for me so that in that moment of pain, in the moment of loss, in the moment of difficulty in my life, I could know that he was there with me.
Have you ever seen something that you can't unsee? For me, it was when I went to see The Passion of the Christ, this movie that came out just a couple years after I started believing in Jesus. Up until that point, I really had no framework around Good Friday. I didn't understand what it was. I didn't understand why it would be a day that we would remember. To me, I associate good with happy and joyful. And so Good Friday must be a happy and joyful day that we remember. But sitting in that movie theater, all of a sudden, everything changed. There was a moment where I couldn't even breathe as I watched Jesus' body being beaten beyond recognition. Then he's hanging on the cross. And all I can think is, that should be me. That should be my flesh that is torn for the lies that I've told. That should be my bones that are broken because of the words that I've said. That should be my head dripping blood because of the people that I've hurt. It was my sin that put Jesus on that cross. And I couldn't unsee that image. Good Friday for me has changed forever because that's not just a movie that I watched. I saw minutes of the suffering that Jesus endured for me, what took hours in real life. And I could hardly catch my breath. It was too much. Realizing that the suffering that Jesus took on was because of my sin, because of my choices that I had made, was making, and would continue to make. I don't know about you, but for me, I avoid suffering at all costs. I don't want to feel pain. And yet Jesus stepped out of the perfection of heaven and onto that cross because he loved me. Those are images that are burned into my heart, into my mind, into my eyes. And Good Friday has changed forever.
So the church that I grew up in really didn't celebrate Good Friday. I honestly wasn't even fully aware that it was like a thing that people did around church. I grew up in a church where we celebrated Easter and we did normal Easter stuff, and it felt great, but there was a part of my faith experience that I think as I got older and started to experience Good Friday and celebrate it in different churches, that I started to realize there was something that I had been missing, especially as a child. See, Good Friday introduces you and me not to just the pleasure of what it means to know and follow Jesus, but to the pain of this world, to the fact that there is hurt and loss that Jesus stepped into. And because he did, it can give us hope as we do. I think all of us can reflect back on this last year and see how that's such an important aspect of being honest about what it is we're going through and the battles that we're facing every single day. I remember last year, right before the shutdown took place, I was at a basketball game with a friend, and we were talking about this and kind of going, do you think this is going to become as big as it seems like it's going to become? And I mean, we were at a very full basketball game, and it was only days later that everything stopped. And in a moment, we didn't realize how big a swing we had just taken. As a matter of fact, I think that basically we have experienced loss as a planet for the last year in a way like we never have in our generation. And we went from let's slow the spread to let's be responsible to let's find a cure. And all of a sudden, these things got all complicated. And we wrestled through what it was going to mean in the spring. And then things maybe seemed to start to come back a little bit to normal just in time for us to have a really controversial election, just in time for us to have a second wave, just in time for more controversy and more pain and more loss. And it wasn't just happening at a big scale. It was happening individually. It was happening in my family. It was happening in your family. It was happening with students who were missing out on opportunities to have a last season, to be able to go to prom one more time, to be able to experience milestones in life that had been set up. The number of conversations I've had this year with people who have had to change or cancel their plans to get married, people who have not had a chance to be with loved ones in the hospital or even funerals. I mean, things have been heavy. And I think if we're not careful and we just skip by days like Good Friday, we just bury the pain. But what happens for me, I'm guessing maybe happens for you too, is that pain and hurt doesn't go away. It just shows up in other ways. It shows up in relationships that it has no business showing up in. It shows up in problems and challenges that get a bunch of your heat that never deserve that much heat. And Good Friday, I think, is an invitation for us to feel the weight of the brokenness of our world, for us to be reminded of the cost to which Jesus was willing to pay so that that pain and that hurt and that weight wouldn't be forever. The stories that we've talked about are about our own experiences, about what Good Friday means to us, and what I've learned as an adult that's so different than what I grew up with is that understanding and experiencing pain and loss in this life, and understanding that through the lens of the compassion and the mercy and the empathy of Jesus doing that on my behalf, it isn't just helpful, it's necessary. And so maybe for you, because this is a different format and we're inviting you to experience this, you're checking this out for the very first time. And I would say, as we celebrate this time together, don't let the end of this be the end of your reflection. Even as you continue to prepare for Easter, let the weight of what Jesus did for you and me remind us of the weight that we're still going through today.
Before Jesus went through the pain and the agony and the suffering, before Jesus hung on a cross and ultimately gave his life, he sat down with his friends. He sat down with the disciples and he actually invited them into a moment. And we want to have that moment together right now. It's a moment where he introduced something called communion, which was a way for him to say, hey, I'm about to step into something that you're not fully going to understand. And I think that still stands true for us today. And he said, as I introduce this to you today, I want you to continue to remember what's about to happen over the next couple days. And we sit in that thousands of years later, and we still sit in a moment of communion, remembering what Jesus did. In fact, what we remember is we remember a Jesus who lived a perfect life, a life of abundance. We remember a Jesus who died a painful death that's full of power. And we remember a life of Jesus that was given sacrificially to us, for everyone, forever. Before Jesus was buried in a tomb, before Jesus hung on a cross, before Jesus endured all sorts of suffering at the hands of so many, before Jesus was betrayed, he took a moment. And he took a moment around a table with a group of friends. And I want to take a moment with you guys here now to experience a similar moment. A moment where Jesus sat down and brought bread and wine and said, I want to give you something to remember what's about to happen. You see, in this moment, he gave them a piece of bread and he broke it and he handed it around the circle so that each one of his friends, each one of these disciples would take a piece of this bread. And he said, this is my body given for you. And then he pauses and he brings wine out and he pours the wine and he passes it around. And he said, this is my blood poured out for you. And he invited each person at this table to experience this moment as a reflection for something they didn't understand. And honestly, I'm not sure we do either. A moment where we can sit and remember the suffering of Jesus. We get to remember the life of Jesus, which was lived in abundance. We get to remember the death of Jesus, which was painful and powerful. And we remember the gift of sacrificial love that Jesus gave when he gave everything for everyone forever. You see, while the disciples didn't fully understand what was going to happen over the course of the next few days, we get to sit and remember something that has happened. A moment that Jesus has already lived, to taste suffering, to taste pain, and to endure the cross for our sake. This isn't a small moment. This was a big moment that Jesus intentionally paused to have in order to invite all of us to experience what we'll never fully understand, to experience something that we will never fully earn, to experience something we never deserved in the first place. We get to experience the brokenness of a Jesus who loved us enough to endure death on our behalf. We want to encourage you to have a moment similar to that of the disciples and Jesus, to specifically spend a moment reflecting, a moment remembering what Jesus has done for us,
to allow ourselves for just a second to reflect on our own suffering and on the suffering Jesus has done on our behalf. That's what I'd love for you to do right now, is to sit and to reflect and to remember and to listen to this song that tells a story of a scandalous death that frees you and me despite the fact that we haven't earned it and we don't deserve it, and yet he gives it freely to us. Take a moment right now.
Grace, what have you done? Murdered for me on that cross, accused in absence of wrong, my sin washed away in your blood. Too much to make sense of it all. I know that your love breaks my fall. The scandal of grace, you died in my place, so my soul will live. Oh, to be like you, I give all I have just to know you. Jesus, there's no one beside you. Forever the hope in my heart. Because of you, Jesus, it's all. Because of you, Jesus, it's all. Because of your love that my soul will live. Oh, to be like you, I give all I have just to know you. Jesus, there's no one beside you. Forever